The plantation owner had made it very clear what he would do to runaway slaves, especially ones who had killed his overseer, even if it was self-defense. Even if the overseer had cornered her in the barn and tried to force himself on her. Even if she had only grabbed the pitchfork to protect herself. None of that would matter to Marcus Whitfield. In his eyes, she was property that had damaged valuable goods. The fact that she had saved her own life meant nothing. Sarah pulled her knees to her chest and tried to get warm. The cabin had a small fireplace, but she didn't dare light it. Smoke would give away her location. Instead, she found a rough blanket hanging on a peg and wrapped it around her shoulders. The blanket smelled like pine and something else. Something clean and masculine that made her feel safer somehow. Hours passed. The storm outside began to calm, and pale morning light filtered through the gaps in the shutters. Sarah had dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every sound. Now, she heard something that made her blood freeze. Footsteps on the cabin porch. Heavy boots, moving slowly and deliberately. Sarah scrambled to her feet, looking around wildly for somewhere to hide. The cabin was too small, too open. There was nowhere to go. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. "I know you're in there." The voice was deep and calm, not angry or threatening. But that meant nothing. Sarah had learned not to trust men's voices. "Please," she called out, hating how small and frightened she sounded. "Please, I'll leave. I didn't take anything. I was just trying to get out of the storm. Open the door." Sarah's hands shook as she reached for the latch. She had no choice. If this man wanted to hurt her, a wooden door wouldn't stop him. She pulled it open slowly and found herself looking up at the tallest man she had ever seen. He stood at least 6.5 feet tall, with broad shoulders that filled the doorway. His hair was dark brown, almost black, and his eyes were the color of steel. He wore simple clothes, dark pants, a white shirt, and a brown leather vest, but they were well-made and clean. What struck Sarah most was his face. It was handsome in a rough way, with strong features and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from granite. But his eyes were kind. They looked at her with concern, not anger or lust. "You're hurt," he said, stepping into the cabin without invitation. Sarah backed away instinctively. I'm fine," she lied. The man looked her over carefully, taking in her torn dress, her muddy feet, and the cut on her cheek where a tree branch had scraped her during her flight through the woods. "No, you're not," he said simply. "Sit down before you fall down." "I should go," Sarah said, even though her legs felt like they might give out at any moment. "Where?" The man closed the door behind him and moved to the fireplace. "Back in the woods? Back to wherever you came from." Sarah's breath caught. Did he know? Had word already spread about what happened at the Whitfield plantation? The man began building a fire, his movements sure and practiced. "My name is James Carson," he said without looking at her. "This is my cabin. I live about 5 miles east of here, but I come here when I need to think." He struck a match and held it to the kindling. Small flames began to dance and grow. "I won't hurt you," he continued, still focused on the fire. "And I won't force you to tell me anything you don't want to tell me. But you look like you haven't eaten in days, and that cut needs tending." Sarah wanted to run, but where could she go? She was exhausted, hungry, and lost. This man, James, seemed different from other white men she had known. He didn't try to grab her or order her around. He hadn't even looked at her like she was less than human. Maybe she could trust him, just for a little while. "Thank you," she whispered, sinking onto a wooden chair near the fire. James nodded and went to a cabinet in the corner. He pulled out a cloth, a bottle of something clear, and a small pot. "This might sting," he warned, dampening the cloth with liquid from the bottle. Sarah tensed as he approached, but James moved slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. When she didn't, he gently cleaned the cut on her cheek. The liquid did sting, but his touch was careful and gentle. "What's your name?" he asked softly. Sarah hesitated. Giving her real name felt dangerous, but lying felt wrong too. This man was helping her when he could have turned her away or worse. "Sarah," she said finally. "Sarah." James tested the name, and somehow it sounded different when he said it. Not like property or a thing to be used, but like a real person's name. Are you hungry, Sarah? Sarah's stomach answered before she could, growling loudly in the quiet cabin. James smiled, the first real smile she had seen from a white man in longer than she could remember. I'll take that as a yes. He moved around the small cabin with practiced ease, pulling out bread, cheese, and dried meat. He cut everything into generous portions and handed her a plate. Sarah stared at the food. It was more than she usually ate in 2 days at the plantation. Are you sure? She asked. Eat, James said firmly. You need your strength. Sarah ate slowly at first, then more quickly as hunger overtook caution. The food was simple but good, and she felt strength returning to her body with each bite. James sat across from her, eating his own smaller portion and watching the fire. He didn't stare at her or ask uncomfortable questions. He just let her eat in peace. When she was finished, Sarah felt more human than she had in days. The warmth of the fire and the food in her stomach made her drowsy, but she fought to stay alert. She couldn't let her guard down completely. Where are you from? James asked eventually. Sarah's whole body went tense. This was the question she had been dreading. I can't tell you that, she said quietly. James nodded as if he had expected that answer. Are you in trouble? Sarah looked down at her hands. There was still blood under her fingernails. The overseer's blood. Yes, she whispered. Bad trouble. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. James was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful. I inherited a large piece of land about 10 miles north of here. It's good land, fertile, and well-watered. I've been thinking about starting a proper homestead there. Sarah looked up at him, confused by the sudden change of subject. The thing is, James continued, it's a big job for one man. I could use help. Someone to cook and keep house while I get the farm established. Someone who knows how to work hard and isn't afraid of starting over. Sarah's heart began to race. Was he offering her a job? Or was this some kind of trap? I can pay fair wages, James said, looking directly at her for the first time since they had started talking. And I can provide protection. The homestead is isolated, far from prying eyes and unwanted questions. Why? Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. Why would you help me? James was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, there was something sad in his voice. My father owned slaves, he said quietly. I grew up watching what that did to people. Good people turned into monsters by the belief that they owned other human beings. I swore I would never be part of that system. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the forest. When the war started, I sold everything I had in Virginia and came west. I wanted to start fresh in a place where I could live according to my own beliefs. Sarah studied his profile as he stood by the window. There was something honest about the way he held himself, something that made her want to believe him. What happened to you? James asked without turning around. What kind of trouble are you running from? Sarah closed her eyes. She could still see the overseer's face, twisted with rage and lust. She could still feel his hands grabbing at her, tearing her dress. She could still feel the weight of the pitchfork in her hands and the terrible resistance when it found its target. I killed a man, she said simply. James turned around slowly. His face showed no shock or disgust, just careful attention. Did he deserve it? James asked. The question surprised Sarah. No one had ever asked her that before. They had only cared that she had damaged valuable property. Yes, she said firmly. He was trying to... She stopped, unable to say the words. James nodded grimly. I see. And now his people want revenge. They want to make an example of me, Sarah said. To show other slaves what happens when they fight back. James walked back to the fire and sat down across from her again. What's your full name, Sarah? Sarah Mills, she said. The surname had been given to her by her first owner, a man she barely remembered. Well, Sarah Mills, James said seriously, I'm going to make you a promise. If you come with me to my homestead, you'll never have to go back to that life. Whatever you were before, whoever you were running from, that ends the day we leave this cabin. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. It sounded too good to be true. What if they find me? What if they come looking? Then they'll have to go through me first, James said simply. And I don't plan on making that easy for them. There was something in his voice, a quiet strength that made Sarah believe he meant every word. But trust didn't come easily to her anymore. I don't understand, she said. You don't know me. You don't know what I've done or where I come from. Why would you risk so much for a stranger? James leaned forward, his gray eyes serious. Do you believe that all people are created equal, Sarah? The question caught her off guard. What do you mean? Do you believe that you have the same right to life and freedom as any white man or woman? Do you believe that the color of your skin doesn't make you worth less than anyone else? Sarah had never been asked to think about such things before. At the plantation, such ideas were not just forbidden, but dangerous. Slaves who got ideas about equality ended up beaten or sold away from their families. I don't know, she said honestly. Well, I do, James said firmly. I believe it with everything in me. And I believe that what happened to you, whatever it was wrong. Not because you're my property or under my protection, but because you're a human being with a right to defend yourself. Sarah stared at him. She had never heard a white man talk like this before. It was frightening and wonderful at the same time. What would I have to do? She asked quietly. At your homestead, honest work for honest pay, James said. Cooking, cleaning, maybe helping with the garden once we get one established. Nothing you wouldn't do in any other household, except you'd be paid for it and treated with respect. And if I wanted to leave, then you'd leave, James said without hesitation. You'd be a free woman, Sarah, free to make your own choices. Free. The word hung in the air between them, like a promise too precious to touch. They're still looking for me, Sarah said. If I stay with you, I'd be putting you in danger too. James smiled grimly. Let me worry about that. I've been in danger before. Something in his tone made Sarah look at him more carefully. There was a hardness around his eyes that spoke of experience with violence. This was not a soft man who had lived an easy life. Were you in the war? She asked. James nodded. 3 years with the Union Army. I've seen what men can do to each other when they think God is on their side. That explained the quiet confidence, the way he moved like someone who was comfortable with conflict. Sarah felt a little safer knowing that James could defend himself and her if necessary. I'm scared, she admitted. You should be, James said honestly. What you're doing takes courage. Starting over, trusting a stranger, believing that your life can be different than it's been. That's terrifying for anyone. Sarah appreciated his honesty. He wasn't trying to tell her that everything would be easy or that there was nothing to fear. But James continued, being scared doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means you need to be careful and smart about how you do it. Sarah looked around the small cabin. Outside, she could hear birds singing and the gentle sound of wind in the trees. It was peaceful here, safe, but she knew it couldn't last. She had to make a decision about her future, and she had to make it soon. If I come with you, she said slowly, what happens to Sarah Mills? The runaway slave who killed a white man. James looked directly into her eyes. Sarah Mills died in these woods 3 days ago, he said quietly. What rises from her ashes is a free woman who chooses her own path. The words sent a shiver through Sarah's body. Could it really be that simple? Could she really leave her past behind and start fresh? Think about it tonight, James said, standing up. I'll sleep outside by the fire. You can have the cabin to yourself. In the morning, you can give me your answer. You do that? Sarah asked, surprised. Sleep outside in the cold? Sarah, James said gently, you've been running for days from men who want to hurt you. The last thing you need is to worry about being alone in a cabin with another man, even one who means you no harm. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes again. When was the last time a man had considered her comfort and safety before his own convenience? James gathered a blanket and headed for the door. There's more food in the cabinet if you get hungry during the night, he said. And there's a bowl on the inside of the door if it makes you feel safer. After he left, Sarah sat by the fire for a long time, thinking. Outside, she could hear James moving around as he set up his bedroll, near the fire he had built in the stone circle outside the cabin. For the first time in years, Sarah allowed herself to imagine a different kind of life. A life where she could walk freely without looking over her shoulder. A life where she could earn her own money and make her own decisions. A life where she was treated as a human being instead of property. It seemed too good to be true, but maybe, just maybe it was possible. Sarah pulled the blanket around her shoulders and settled into the chair by the fire. Tomorrow she would have to decide whether to trust this strange man who offered her everything she had ever dreamed of. Tonight, for the first time in 3 days, she felt safe enough to really sleep. Outside, the fire crackled softly, and James Carson stood watch through the long night, keeping guard over the woman who might become his partner in building a new kind of life on the frontier. A life built on respect, equality, and the radical idea that all people deserve to be free. Sarah woke to the smell of coffee and bacon cooking over an open fire. For a moment, she forgot where she was and tensed, expecting to hear the harsh voice of the plantation overseer calling slaves to work. Then, she remembered. The cabin. The storm. James Carson. She sat up slowly, her body still aching from 3 days of running through the wilderness. Through the cabin's single window, she could see James crouched by a fire outside, tending to a pan of sizzling bacon. He moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in the outdoors. Sarah had slept better than she had in months, maybe years. For the first time since she could remember, she had gone to sleep without fear. The knowledge that someone was standing guard, that someone cared about her safety, had allowed her to truly rest. She stood and smoothed her torn dress as best she could. Her reflection in the small mirror above the wash basin showed a woman she barely recognized. Her face was thinner than it had been at the plantation, marked by exhaustion and fear. But there was something different in her eyes this morning. A spark of hope that had been missing for so long she had forgotten it could exist. James looked up as she emerged from the cabin. "Good morning," he said simply. "Coffee, please," Sarah replied, accepting the tin cup he handed her. The coffee was strong and hot, exactly what she needed. They ate breakfast in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher through the trees. Sarah found herself studying James when he wasn't looking. He was probably in his early 30s, she guessed, with the weathered hands and face of someone who spent his time outdoors. There was a calmness about him that she found reassuring. "Have you thought about my offer?" James asked finally, setting down his empty coffee cup. Sarah nodded. She had thought about little else during the night. "I have some questions first." "Ask them." "This homestead you want to build, where exactly is it?" James pulled out a hand-drawn map from his shirt pocket and spread it on a flat rock between them. "Here," he said, pointing to a spot marked with an X. "It's in the Kansas Territory, about 50 miles northwest of here. The land is good, fertile soil, fresh water from a creek that runs year-round, and timber for building." Sarah studied the map. The homestead was indeed isolated, far from any towns or major roads. That would make it harder for Marcus Whitfield's men to find her, but it would also mean they would be completely on their own. "Have you seen the land?" she asked. "I've been there twice. Once to file the claim, and once to scout it properly. It's beautiful country, Sarah. Rolling hills covered in grass, stands of oak and maple trees, wildflowers everywhere in the spring." His voice carried genuine enthusiasm. "It's the kind of place where a person could build something lasting." "What about neighbors?" "The nearest homestead is about 15 miles south. A family named Peterson. They seem like good people, helped me file my claim, and gave me advice about the land." Sarah nodded, making mental notes. Isolation could be protection, but it could also mean no help if trouble came calling. "You said you'd pay wages," she continued. "How much?" James named a sum that made Sarah's eyes widen. It was more money than most slaves saw in a lifetime. "That's too much," she said automatically. James smiled. "Says who? You'll be doing the work of running a household while I'm clearing land and building. In town, a housekeeper with your skills would earn that much easily." "You don't know what skills I have," Sarah pointed out. "Can you cook?" "Yes." "Keep a house clean?" And organized? Yes. Tend a garden? I grew up working in the plantation's vegetable garden, Sarah said. I know about planting, weeding, preserving food for winter. Then, you have exactly the skills I need, James said firmly. Don't sell yourself short, Sarah. You're worth fair wages for fair work. The idea of being paid for her labor was still difficult to grasp. At the plantation, slaves worked because they were forced to. The only reward was avoiding punishment. The concept of earning money for herself felt almost magical. What if the law comes looking for me? Sarah asked, voicing her deepest fear. What if Marcus Whitfield's men track me down? James's expression grew serious. What's this Marcus Whitfield's full name? Marcus Whitfield. He owns a cotton plantation about 100 miles southeast of here. James nodded slowly. I've heard the name. He has a reputation for being particularly cruel, even by plantation standards. Sarah shuddered, remembering the stories she had heard about other slaves who had tried to escape. Marcus Whitfield made examples of runaways in ways that still gave her nightmares. If they come, James continued, they'll be looking for a runaway slave named Sarah Mills. But there won't be any such person in my homestead. What do you mean? James leaned forward, his gray eyes intense. I mean, we create a new identity for you. A new name, a new history. As far as anyone knows, you're a free woman I hired from back east to help establish my homestead. Sarah frowned. Won't people ask questions? A white man and a colored woman living on an isolated homestead. Let them ask, James said with a shrug. It's not illegal to hire a housekeeper, and anyone who has a problem with it can mind their own business. His casual confidence amazed Sarah. He seemed genuinely unconcerned about what others might think or say. But what if they don't believe it? She pressed. What if they demand papers proving I'm free? James was quiet for a moment, thinking, there are ways to get proper papers, he said finally. I have contacts from the war. People who understand that sometimes the law and justice aren't the same thing. Sarah felt a chill of excitement mixed with terror. He was talking about forged documents, about completely changing her identity. It was dangerous and illegal, but it might also be her only chance at true freedom. How do you know you can trust these contacts? Because they saved my life more than once during the war, James said simply. And because they believe the same things I do about equality and freedom. Sarah absorbed this information. James wasn't just offering her a job and protection. He was offering her a completely new life, built on a foundation of lies that would have to hold up under scrutiny. What would my new name be? She asked. That would be up to you. You should choose a name that feels right, that you could live with for the rest of your life. Sarah considered this. The idea of choosing her own name felt incredibly powerful. At the plantation, slaves were named by their owners like livestock. The chance to pick her own identity was almost overwhelming. What about a last name? She asked. Carson, James said without hesitation. Sarah stared at him. Your name? It would be natural for a housekeeper to take her employer's name, especially on an isolated homestead where we'd be living as family. It would also give you my protection in a legal sense. But people might think, Sarah began. Let them think what they want, James interrupted. What matters is that you'd have legal standing as a member of my household. That offers certain protections under the law. Sarah realized he was right. In the eyes of the law, a free woman bearing a white man's name would have status and protection that a runaway slave could never claim. There's something else, James said, looking slightly uncomfortable. Something I should tell you before you make your decision. Sarah tensed. Here it comes, she thought. The catch. The real reason he was being so generous. I'm not asking for anything inappropriate, James said quickly, seeing her expression. Your sleeping arrangements would be completely separate. I'd build you your own cabin, your own space. But there might be times when it would be useful for people to think we were more than employer and employee. What do you mean? James ran a hand through his dark hair. A single man and a single woman living alone on a homestead is going to raise questions no matter what. If people assume we're married, it would actually cause less talk than the truth. Sarah's mind raced. You're asking me to pretend to be your wife. Only if the situation requires it, James said quickly. And Only in public, only when absolutely necessary for your safety. In private, in our daily lives, you'd be a free woman making her own choices. Sarah stared into the fire, thinking hard. It was a complicated arrangement, full of potential problems. But it was also her best chance at escaping Marcus Whitfield and starting over. Why? She asked again. Why are you willing to do all this for someone you just met? James was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft and distant. I told you my father owned slaves, he said. What I didn't tell you is that one of them was a woman named Ruth. She worked in our house, took care of me when I was young. She was kind and gentle, always had a story or a song when I was scared or hurt. James poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the morning air. When I was 12, my father sold her to settle a gambling debt. I begged him not to, cried, and pleaded, but it didn't matter. She was property to him, nothing more. I never saw Ruth again, but I never forgot the look in her eyes when they led her away. Sarah felt tears prick her own eyes. She had seen that look on too many faces, had felt it in her own heart when families were torn apart by the whims of their owners. I swore that day that I would never own another human being, James continued, and that if I ever had the chance to help someone escape that life, I would take it. What if this Ruth is already dead? Sarah asked gently. What if helping me doesn't really help her? James looked directly at her, and Sarah saw a deep pain in his gray eyes. Then, at least I'll know I tried to balance the scales a little, that I did something to make up for the years I stood by, and watched it happen. Sarah understood then. This wasn't really about her, not entirely. James was trying to save his own soul as much as he was trying to save her life. All right, she said quietly. All right, what? All right, I'll come with you. I'll try this new life you're offering. James smiled, and Sarah was struck by how much younger he looked when he was happy. You won't regret it, Sarah. I promise you that. What's my new name going to be? She asked. James thought for a moment. What would you like it to be? Sarah considered. She wanted something completely different from her old life, something that represented the freedom James was offering her. Grace, she said finally. I've always liked that name. Grace Carson, James said, testing how it sounded. I like it. It suits you. Grace Carson. Sarah tried the name on in her mind and found that it felt right. Strong and free and new. When do we leave? She asked. Today, if you're ready. The sooner we get to the homestead, the sooner you'll be truly safe. Sarah looked around the small cabin that had been her refuge for one night. Soon it would be just a memory, a stepping stone between her old life and her new one. I'm ready, she said. They spent the next hour gathering supplies and preparing for the journey. James had a wagon hidden about a mile away, loaded with tools and materials for building the homestead. He also had 2 good horses and enough food to last them several days on the road. As they walked through the forest to where the wagon was hidden, Sarah felt a strange mixture of excitement and terror. Every step took her further from the life she had known and closer to an uncertain future. James, she said as they reached the clearing where the wagon waited. Yes. Thank you. For everything. I know you're taking a big risk. James helped her up onto the wagon seat, then climbed up beside her. We're both taking a risk, Grace. But sometimes that's what freedom costs. As they rolled out of the clearing and onto the rough trail that would take them north to Kansas, Sarah, now Grace, looked back once at the cabin where her old life had ended. Then she turned her face toward the horizon and the new life waiting for her there. The wagon wheels creaked rhythmically as they rolled through the countryside. James drove carefully, staying on smaller roads and avoiding towns where possible. They were fugitives now, Grace realized, partners in a conspiracy that could land them both in jail or worse. But for the first time in her life, Grace felt truly hopeful about the future. Whatever dangers lay ahead, she was no longer facing them alone. She had an ally, a partner who saw her as a human being worthy of respect and freedom. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Grace Carson began to plan her new life on the Kansas frontier, where the past would finally end and the future could begin. The journey to Kansas took 4 days of hard travel on rough frontier roads. Grace learned more about James during those long hours sitting beside him on the wagon seat than she might have in months of normal conversation. He was patient with the horses, never raising his voice even when they balked at difficult terrain. He shared his food equally and always made sure she was comfortable before settling down for the night. When they camped, he slept on the opposite side of the fire, giving her space and privacy. Most importantly, he talked to her like an equal. He asked her opinions about the route, about where to camp, about what supplies they might need for the homestead. Grace had never been asked for her thoughts on anything important before. "Tell me about growing up on the plantation," James said on the second day as they rolled across a broad prairie dotted with wildflowers. Grace tensed. She didn't like thinking about those years, let alone talking about them. "It's all right if you don't want to," James added quickly. "I just thought it might help me understand what you've been through." Grace considered this. If they were going to build a life together, even as employer and employee, he probably should know something about her past. "I was born there," she said finally. "My mother was house slave, named Lily. I never knew my father, but I think he might have been Marcus Whitfield's son. I had lighter skin than most of the field hands." James nodded, but didn't comment. Grace appreciated that he didn't try to offer sympathy or ask probing questions. "When I was little, I worked in the big house with my mother," she continued. "We cleaned and cooked and took care of Whitfield's children. It wasn't terrible work compared to the fields." "What happened to your mother?" Grace's throat tightened. "She got sick when I was about 14. Some kind of fever that went through the slave quarters that winter. A lot of people died. I'm sorry. After she died, they moved me to other work. The vegetable garden mostly, sometimes helping in the kitchen during harvest time. I was lucky. I stayed in the house as servant quarters instead of being sent to the fields." Grace paused, remembering those years. She had been grateful at the time to avoid field work, not understanding that her lighter skin and house training made her valuable to Marcus Whitfield in other ways. "What about the overseer?" James asked quietly. The one you had trouble with." Grace's hands clenched in her lap. "His name was Thomas Hartley. He came to work for Whitfield about 2 years ago. He was different from the other overseers. Meaner. He seemed to enjoy hurting people." She could still see Hartley's face in her mind, pale and pockmarked, with small, cruel eyes that always seemed to be looking for weakness to exploit. "He started paying attention to me last year," Grace continued, forcing herself to keep talking. "Little things at first. Standing too close when he talked to me. Finding excuses to touch my arm or shoulder. Making comments about how pretty I was." James's hands tightened on the reins, but he stayed quiet. "I tried to avoid him, but there's nowhere to hide on a plantation. He had the run of the place. And when I complained to the other house slaves, they just told me to be careful. Everyone was afraid of him." "What happened the night you left?" Grace closed her eyes, remembering. "He cornered me in the barn where we stored feed for the horses. I was getting grain for the morning feeding when he came in behind me. He said he was tired of waiting, that it was time I showed proper gratitude for his protection." Her voice grew harder as she continued. "He grabbed me and tore my dress. He said I belonged to him now, that he could do whatever he wanted with me. He said if I fought him, he'd make sure I got sold to a brothel in New Orleans." James muttered something under his breath that sounded like a curse. "There was a pitchfork leaning against the wall," Grace said simply. "When he pushed me down into the hay, I grabbed it. I told him to stop, to leave me alone. He just laughed and said no one would believe a slave over a white man. So you defended yourself." "I meant to just scare him," Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But he lunged at me, and the pitchfork, it went into his chest. He fell down, and there was blood everywhere. So much blood." Grace shuddered at the memory. She had stood frozen in the barn for what felt like hours, staring at Thomas Hartley's body lying in the hay. "What did you do then?" "I ran. I grabbed some food from the kitchen and ran into the woods. I knew they'd come looking for me as soon as they found his body. I knew what they'd do to me when they caught me." "You did nothing wrong," James said firmly. "A man tried to rape you, and you defended yourself. That's not murder. That's self-defense. Not when you're a slave." Grace replied bitterly. Slaves don't have the right to defend themselves from white men. I killed valuable property, and for that I'd hang if they caught me. Well, they're not going to catch you, James said with quiet determination. Grace Carson has never been to a plantation. She's never met Thomas Hartley. And she's never killed anyone. Grace looked at him sideways. Do you really think it can be that simple? Making it true will take work, James admitted. But yes, I think it can work. We just have to be smart about it. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, watching the landscape change as they traveled north. The countryside here was different from the heavily forested area where they had met. Rolling grassland stretched in all directions, dotted with groves of trees and crossed by small streams. It's beautiful, Grace said, surprised by how much she liked this open country. Wait until you see the homestead land, James said with enthusiasm. It's even better than this. Tell me about your plans. What exactly do you want to build? James's face lit up as he described his vision. I want to create something lasting, something that can support not just us, but maybe other people too. Good farmland that can produce grain and vegetables, pasture for cattle and horses, orchards for fruit trees. That sounds like more than a homestead, Grace observed. That sounds like a whole community. Maybe someday, James agreed. I've been thinking that there might be other people like us out here. People who want to build something different from what they left behind. Grace wondered what he meant by people like us, but didn't ask. The idea of being part of a real community, a place where she could put down roots and belong, was almost too wonderful to imagine. On the afternoon of the fourth day, James pointed ahead to a line of trees that marked the course of a creek. There it is, he said. Our new home. Grace stood up on a wagon seat to get a better view. The land beyond the trees rose in gentle hills covered with tall grass that waved in the breeze like a green ocean. She could see why James had been drawn to this place. It looked like the kind of country where anything was possible. James guided the wagon down to the creek and stopped in a grove of oak trees that provided shade and shelter. This is where I thought we'd build, he said. Close enough to the water for convenience, but high enough that we won't flood in the spring. Grace climbed down from the wagon and walked to the edge of the creek. The water was clear and cold, running over smooth stones with a musical sound that she found immediately peaceful. It's perfect, she said and meant it. I'm glad you like it, James replied, beginning to unhitch the horses. Because we've got a lot of work ahead of us. Over the next hour, James showed Grace around the property, pointing out the best locations for a house, a barn, and gardens. His enthusiasm was infectious, and Grace found herself getting excited about the possibilities. The cabin will go there, James said, pointing to a level spot about 100 yards from the creek. One big room for now, with a loft for sleeping. We can add on as we need more space. What about my separate cabin? Grace asked. James looked slightly embarrassed. Well, that will have to wait until we get the main cabin finished. I hope you don't mind sharing space for a few weeks. I can set up a partition for privacy. Grace realized she had been expecting too much too soon. Building a homestead from nothing would take time and hard work. She would have to be patient. That's fine, she said. I'm used to sharing space. They spent the rest of the daylight hours unloading the wagon and setting up a temporary camp. James had brought canvas to make a shelter, cooking pots, tools, lumber, and everything else they would need to get started. As Grace prepared their first dinner on the homestead, cooking over an open fire while James tended to the horses, she felt a strange sense of peace settling over her. For the first time in her life, she was somewhere she chose to be, working alongside someone who treated her as an equal. Grace, James called as she was serving the meal. Yes. Welcome home. The words sent a warm glow through Grace's chest. Home. She had never had a real home before, just places where she was kept and forced to work. But this felt different. This felt like a place where she could truly belong. As they ate dinner under the darkening sky, Grace allowed herself to imagine the future James had described. The cabin rising where now there was only grass. Gardens growing beside the creek. Maybe even neighbors someday, people who would know her as Grace Carson, a free woman building a life on the frontier. What do we do first? She asked. Tomorrow we start clearing the building site, James said. Cut down the trees we don't want and dig out the stumps. Then, we start laying the foundation for the cabin. How long will it take? If we work hard and the weather cooperates, maybe 6 weeks for a basic cabin. Longer if we want it really solid. Grace nodded. 6 weeks of hard work to build the foundation of her new life. It seemed like a bargain. James, she said as they finished eating, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Why haven't you ever married? Started a family of your own? James was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. I was engaged once, he said finally, before the war. Her name was Elizabeth. She was beautiful and smart and everything I thought I wanted. What happened? The war happened, and I came back different than when I left. The things I'd seen, the things I'd learned about slavery and equality, they changed me. Elizabeth couldn't understand why I cared so much about issues that didn't affect us directly. Grace waited for him to continue. When I told her I was planning to sell the family property and come west to start over, she gave me back my ring. She said she wasn't going to marry a man who cared more about strangers than his own kind. I'm sorry, Grace said softly. James shrugged. Looking back, I think she was right to break it off. We wanted different things from life. She wanted security and status. I wanted to build something meaningful. Do you regret it? No, James said firmly. I've never regretted choosing my principles over convenience. And if I had married Elizabeth, I wouldn't be here now. I wouldn't have met you or had the chance to build something really worthwhile. Grace felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. You think this will be worthwhile? I think this could be the most important thing either of us ever does, James said seriously. Building a life based on equality and mutual respect. Proving that people can work together regardless of the color of their skin. Maybe even creating something that can serve as an example for others. The scope of his vision took Grace's breath away. She had been thinking in terms of personal freedom and safety. James was thinking about changing the world, one homestead at a time. That's a big responsibility, she said. Yes, it is. But I think we're up to it. As Grace settled into her bedroll that night, listening to the sound of the creek and the gentle night sounds of the prairie, she thought about the weight of James's expectations. He saw their partnership as something larger than just practical cooperation. He saw it as a symbol of what America could become. Grace wasn't sure she was ready for that kind of significance, but she was ready to work hard to prove herself worthy of the freedom James had offered her. And maybe in building a successful homestead together, they really could show the world that equality was not just possible, but profitable. Tomorrow the real work would begin. Tomorrow Grace Carson would start building the life she had never dared to dream of. The stars wheeled overhead, bright and clear in the vast Kansas sky. Somewhere to the south, Marcus Whitfield's men might still be searching for a runaway slave named Sarah Mills. But that woman was gone forever, left behind in the woods of Missouri with her fear and her chains. Grace Carson slept peacefully under the stars, dreaming of the cabin that would rise beside the creek and the free life that was finally within her grasp. The first test of Grace's new identity came sooner than expected. They had been working on the homestead for 2 weeks, making good progress on clearing the building site and gathering materials. Grace had surprised herself with how much she enjoyed the physical work. Swinging an axe to clear brush, digging out stubborn tree roots, and hauling stones for the foundation gave her a sense of accomplishment she had never felt in her old life. James was a patient teacher, showing her how to use tools she had never touched before. He treated her mistakes as learning opportunities rather than failures, and praised her successes without condescension. Grace found herself working harder than she ever had, driven by the knowledge that every stone they moved brought her closer to true freedom. They had just finished laying the first course of the foundation when Grace heard the sound of approaching horses. James heard it too and straightened from his work, shading his eyes to look toward the creek where a group of riders was emerging from the trees. "Stay calm," James said quietly. "Remember, you're Grace Carson, my housekeeper. You've been working for me for 6 months back in Missouri." Grace's heart hammered against her ribs as the riders approached. There were 4 of them, all white men, wearing the kind of rough clothes favored by frontier lawmen or bounty hunters. The leader was a thin man with a scraggly beard and eyes that missed nothing. "Good morning," James called out pleasantly, continuing to work on the foundation as if uninvited visitors were perfectly normal. "Morning," the leader replied, pulling his horse to a stop a few yards away. "I'm Deputy Marshal Frank Stone. We're looking for a runaway slave from Missouri. Young woman, light-skinned, goes by the name of Sarah Mills." Grace continued stacking stones, forcing her hands to remain steady. Inside, every instinct screamed her to run, but there was nowhere to go, and running would only confirm their suspicions. "Can't say I've seen anyone like that," James replied easily. "What's she supposed to have done?" "Killed a white man," Stone said, his eyes never leaving Grace's face. "Stab an overseer with a pitchfork. Her owner is offering a substantial reward for her return." "Alive, I hope," James said with just the right note of casual disapproval. Stone's smile was cold. "Dead or alive, makes no difference to us." Grace felt sick but kept working, moving stones with mechanical precision. She had practiced this moment in her mind dozens of times over the past 2 weeks, but the reality was far more terrifying than she had imagined. "Who's your helper there?" Stone asked, nodding toward Grace. "Grace Carson," James replied without hesitation. "My housekeeper. She came west with me from Missouri to help get this place established." "She's got the right coloring," Stone observed. "Mind if we ask her a few questions?" "Of course not," James said. Then he raised his voice slightly. "Grace, these gentlemen would like to speak with you." Grace wiped her hands on her apron and walked over, keeping her head up and her expression calm. Everything depended on her ability to convince these men that she was exactly what James said she was. "Yes, sir," she said to Stone. "What's your full name, girl?" "Grace Carson, sir." "Where are you from?" Grace had rehearsed this answer many times. "I grew up in St. Louis, sir. My mother was a seamstress there. She passed away last year, and Mr. Carson offered me employment out here." "You got papers proving you're free?" Grace's mouth went dry, but James stepped in smoothly. "Of course she does. Grace, show the marshal your papers." Grace reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a folded document. James had obtained it from his mysterious contacts in Missouri before they left. It declared Grace Carson to be a free woman of color, born in St. Louis to a free mother named Mary Carson. Stone examined the papers carefully, looking for signs of forgery. Grace held her breath, praying the document would pass inspection. Finally, Stone handed it back to her. "These look real enough," he admitted grudgingly. "They are real," James said firmly. "Grace has been in my employment for 6 months. She's an excellent worker and completely trustworthy." 6 months, you say?" Stone's eyes sharpened. "The killing we're investigating happened about 3 weeks ago." "Then, obviously Grace couldn't be your suspect," James replied calmly. "She was with me in Missouri 3 weeks ago, helping me prepare for this move west." Stone studied Grace's face intently, as if trying to see past her carefully constructed facade. Grace met his gaze steadily, drawing on every ounce of courage she possessed. "You ever been on a plantation, girl?" "No, sir," Grace said firmly. "I've lived in the city my whole life." "What about this Thomas Hartley? You ever heard that name?" Grace's blood froze, but she kept her expression blank. "No, sir. Should I have? He's the man that got killed. Overseer at the Whitfield plantation southeast of here." "I've never heard of him or any plantation by that name," Grace said with perfect honesty. As Grace Carson, she truly had never heard those names before. Stone continued questioning her for several more minutes, asking about her work history, her family, her reasons for coming west. Grace answered each question calmly and consistently, sticking to the story she and James had constructed. Finally, Stone seemed satisfied or at least convinced that he couldn't prove otherwise. He folded up his papers and prepared to remount his horse. "If you do see this Sarah Mills," he said to James, "there's a $500 reward. That's good money out here on the frontier." "Indeed it is," James agreed. "I'll keep my eyes open." As the deputy marshals rode away, Grace felt her knees go weak with relief. She had passed the test. The carefully constructed identity that she and James had built had held up under official scrutiny. "Well done," James said quietly once the men were out of earshot. "You handled that perfectly." "I thought I was going to be sick," Grace admitted, sinking down onto a pile of lumber. "But you didn't show it. That's what mattered." Grace looked down at the papers in her hands, the documents that had just saved her life. "Where did you really get these?" "Like I told you, I have contacts from the war. People who believe that sometimes the law and justice aren't the same thing." James sat down beside her. "Those papers are legally valid, Grace. You're not pretending to be free. You actually are free now. What if they come back? What if they don't believe our story?" "They won't come back," James said confidently. Stone is a bounty hunter, not a detective. He was hoping for an easy capture and a quick reward. When that didn't happen, he moved on to easier prey. Over the following days, Grace found herself gradually relaxing. The visit from the deputy marshals had been terrifying, but it had also proven that her new identity was solid. She really was Grace Carson now, a free woman building a life on the Kansas frontier. The work on the homestead continued at a steady pace. By the end of their first month, they had completed the foundation and begun raising the walls of the cabin. Grace learned to notch logs, chink gaps with clay and moss, and set window frames. Her hands grew calloused and strong from the unfamiliar work. James was an excellent teacher and an even better partner. He never talked down to her or dismissed her ideas. When Grace suggested moving the kitchen window to catch more light, he agreed immediately and altered his plans. When she proposed a larger root cellar for storing vegetables, he praised her practical thinking and began digging. They fell into comfortable routines. Grace cooked their meals over the campfire each morning and evening, while James tended to the horses and planned the day's work. They labored side by side during the hot afternoon hours, then sat by the fire in the evenings discussing plans for the next day. It was during one of these evening conversations that Grace first brought up the subject that had been troubling her. "James," she said, stirring the fire with a stick, "what happens when winter comes?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, what happens to our arrangement? To us?" Grace struggled to find the right words. "Right now, we're camping out, working together to get the cabin built. But once we're established, once we have proper living quarters..." James seemed to understand her concern. "You're wondering if I'll expect something more from you than housekeeping." "Yes." Grace felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but this was too important to ignore. James was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. When he spoke, his voice was serious and thoughtful. "Grace, I want you to understand something. When I offered you this arrangement, I meant exactly what I said. You're a free woman working for fair wages. Nothing more, nothing less. But we're living together, sharing the same space." Temporarily, James interrupted. "And only out of necessity. I meant what I said about building you your own cabin. It will happen as soon as the main house is finished and we're established for winter." Grace felt some of her tension ease, but she wasn't finished with the conversation yet. "What about the pretending to be married part? When people assume things about us?" James poked at the fire thoughtfully. "That's more complicated," he admitted. "There will probably be times when it's safer and easier to let people think we're married than to explain the truth. But that would only be in public, only when absolutely necessary. And in private? In private, you're Grace Carson, free woman, and my business partner. Nothing happens between us that you don't want to happen." Business partner. Grace liked the sound of that. It implied equality and mutual benefit rather than dependence. "What if I wanted something to happen?" she asked quietly, surprising herself with her boldness. James looked at her sharply. "What do you mean?" Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks, but forced herself to continue. "I mean, what if someday I wanted our arrangement to be more than just business? What if I wanted it to be real?" James stared at her for a long moment, and Grace saw something flicker in his gray eyes. Interest? Hope? She couldn't tell. "Grace," he said carefully, "you've been through terrible trauma. You're grateful for the safety and freedom I've offered you. Sometimes gratitude can feel like something else. You think I'm confused about my own feelings? I think you've never had the chance to make a free choice about anything, especially about men. I don't want to take advantage of that vulnerability. Grace considered his words. There was wisdom in them, but also something that felt like rejection. So you're saying no? I'm saying not now. Not while you're still figuring out who Grace Carson is and what she wants from life. James leaned forward, his expression intense. But, Grace, if someday you decide you want more than a business arrangement, and if I believe you're making that choice freely, without gratitude or fear influencing your decision, then what? James smiled, and Grace felt her heart skip a beat. Then, we'll see what happens. It wasn't a promise, but it wasn't a rejection either. It was hope, carefully offered and freely given. As summer progressed into early fall, Grace found herself growing more confident in her new identity. She and James traveled to the nearest town, a small settlement called Cedar Falls, to buy supplies and establish themselves in the community. Grace was nervous about her first real test as a free woman, but the trip went smoothly. The shopkeepers treated her with the polite distance typically shown to servants of respectable white men. No one questioned her status or demanded to see her papers. Most importantly, Grace began to believe in her own freedom. She wasn't just pretending to be free. She was actually living as a free woman. She earned wages for her work, made decisions about how to spend her time, and spoke her mind without fear of punishment. The cabin was nearly finished by the time the first frost appeared on the grass. It was a solid, well-built structure with 2 rooms, a large fireplace, and real glass windows that James had hauled all the way from Missouri. Grace had never lived anywhere so fine. "What do you think?" James asked as they stood in the completed main room, admiring their work. "It's beautiful," Grace said, and meant it. The cabin wasn't fancy, but it was clean and comfortable and built with care. More importantly, it was theirs. "Tomorrow we start on your cabin," James said. "A smaller version, but just as solid. It should be finished before the really cold weather sets in." Grace nodded, though she felt a strange reluctance about the idea of separate living quarters. Over the months of working together, she and James had developed an easy partnership that went beyond employer and employee. They were friends, confidants, and collaborators in building something important. Living apart would change that dynamic, and Grace wasn't sure she wanted it to change. "James," she said impulsively, "what if I don't want my own cabin?" He turned to look at her in surprise. "What do you mean? What if I want to share this one with you? Not as your employee, or even as someone pretending to be your wife, but as your real partner." James stared at her, and Grace saw hope and uncertainty warring in his expression. "Grace, are you sure? This isn't gratitude talking." "I'm sure," Grace said firmly. "I've had months to think about it, to figure out what I want. I want this life, this partnership, this future we're building together. And I want it to be real." James crossed the room slowly, stopping just in front of her. "If we do this, there's no going back. We'd be taking on the world together, as equals." "I know," Grace said. "I'm ready for that." James reached out and gently touched her cheek. "Grace Carson," he said softly, "will you marry me? For real this time?" "Yes," Grace said without hesitation. "Yes, James Carson, I'll marry you." As they embraced in their newly built cabin, Grace felt the last chains of her old life fall away forever. Sarah Mills, the frightened slave who had fled into the Missouri woods, was truly gone. In her place stood Grace Carson, free woman and equal partner in a love story that had grown from desperation into hope and, finally, into joy. Outside, snow began to fall on the Kansas prairie, blanketing their homestead in pristine white. Inside the warm cabin, Grace and James began planning not just for winter, but for a lifetime together as husband and wife on the frontier they had claimed as their own. The wedding took place on a crisp October morning in front of the cabin they had built together. There was no church nearby and no minister, But James had discovered that Kansas territorial law allowed couples to marry themselves with proper witnesses. Their witnesses were the Peterson family from 15 miles south, Henrik and Anna Peterson, and their 3 children. The Petersons had become friends over the summer, stopping by occasionally to check on the new settlers and offer advice about frontier life. Anna Peterson had been particularly kind to Grace, treating her as a neighbor and friend rather than a curiosity. When James had ridden to their homestead to invite them to the wedding, Anna had insisted on bringing her best dress for Grace to wear and a special cake for the celebration. "You look beautiful," Anna said as she helped Grace dress in the small bedroom they had added to the cabin. The dress was simple but well-made, in a deep blue that complemented Grace's complexion. "I feel like I'm dreaming," Grace admitted, smoothing the skirt with nervous hands. "Marriage always feels that way at first," Anna said with a knowing smile. "But James is a good man. You're lucky to have found each other." Grace thought about the long journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a terrified runaway, sleeping in an abandoned cabin. Now she was about to marry a man who treated her as an equal and had helped her build a life based on love and respect. "I'm lucky," Grace agreed. "Luckier than I ever thought possible." Outside, she could hear James talking with Henrik Peterson about plans for expanding the farm in the spring. Their voices carried the easy confidence of men discussing a bright future. When Grace emerged from the cabin, she found James waiting for her beside the creek where they had first camped together. He wore his best clothes, dark pants, a white shirt, and a black vest, and his hair was neatly combed back from his face. But it was his expression that took Grace's breath away. He looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in the world, as if he couldn't quite believe his good fortune in finding her. "Grace Carson," he said softly as she approached. "Are you ready to make this official?" "I've been ready for months," Grace replied, taking his offered hand. The ceremony itself was simple. In the absence of a minister, Henrik Peterson read from his family Bible, while Grace and James spoke the traditional vows to each other. They exchanged rings that James had crafted from Missouri silver, simple bands that reflected their practical approach to life. When Henrik pronounced them husband and wife, James kissed Grace gently in front of their small group of witnesses. It was the first time they had kissed as more than friends, and Grace felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with gratitude or desperation, and everything to do with love. Anna Peterson wiped tears from her eyes as she hugged Grace. "Welcome to the family," she said warmly. They spent the afternoon celebrating with the Petersons, sharing Anna's cake, and talking about their plans for the homestead. Grace found herself relaxing into the role of wife and hostess, something that felt natural and right. As evening approached, and the Petersons prepared to return to their own homestead, Henrik pulled James aside for a private conversation. "James," he said seriously, "I want you to know that Anna and I support what you're doing here. Building a life with Grace, treating her as an equal, it's the right thing to do." "Thank you," James replied. "That means a lot to us." "There are others in the territory who might not see it the same way," Henrik warned. "People who have strong feelings about racial mixing, especially if they find out about Grace's past. We'll handle whatever comes," James said firmly. "I know you will. But if you ever need help, if trouble comes calling, you can count on us. Anna, and I believe that love is love, regardless of the color of skin involved." That night, as Grace and James sat by the fire in their cabin, now truly their home, Grace felt a peace she had never known before. She was married to a man who loved and respected her. She had friends who accepted her as an equal. She had a home that belonged to her as much as to her husband. "What are you thinking about?" James asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "Just how different my life is now," Grace replied. 6 months ago, I thought I would either be recaptured and hanged or spend the rest of my life running and hiding. I never imagined I could have this." James reached over and took her hand. "What we have now is just the beginning," he said. "Tomorrow we start building our real future together." "What do you mean?" James grinned, and Grace saw the enthusiastic dreamer who had first described his vision for the homestead. We're going to make this place into something special. Not just a farm, but a real community. A place where people can come to start over, regardless of their past or the color of their skin. That's a big dream, Grace said. The best dreams usually are. James squeezed her hand. But I think we can do it. We've already proven that people can work together as equals if they're willing to try. Over the winter months, Grace and James settled into married life with surprising ease. They worked together on indoor projects, making furniture, planning next year's garden, and improving their cabin. Grace learned to read and write from James, while she taught him advanced cooking and preservation techniques she had learned at the plantation. They talked endlessly about their plans for the homestead, dreaming of the day when they might have neighbors who shared their values of equality and hard work. James wrote letters to contact from his military service, describing the opportunities available in Kansas for people willing to start fresh. In February, they received their first positive response. A letter from a man named Samuel Johnson, a freed slave from Kentucky who had fought alongside James during the war. Sam wants to bring his wife and children west, James told Grace excitedly as he read the letter. He's heard about the homestead opportunities and wants to claim land near us. Would he be safe here? Grace asked, remembering her own close call with the deputy marshals. Safer than in Kentucky, James replied. And we'd be here to help if anyone gave him trouble. Then tell him to come, Grace said decisively. It would be wonderful to have neighbors who understand what it means to fight for freedom. Spring brought a flurry of activity as Grace and James prepared for their first full growing season. They plowed fields for wheat and corn, planted a large vegetable garden, and built a proper barn for the livestock they planned to acquire. In May, the Johnson family arrived in a covered wagon loaded with possessions and hopes for a better life. Samuel Johnson was a tall, serious man with graying hair and intelligent eyes. His wife Mary was a skilled seamstress and nurse, while their 3 children were eager to explore their new home. Grace felt an immediate kinship with Mary Johnson. Both women understood what it meant to live in constant fear of discovery, to dream of true freedom while doubting it was possible. It's real, isn't it? Mary asked Grace as they worked together in the garden. This freedom, this life we're building, it's not just pretend. It's real, Grace assured her. Sometimes I still can't believe it myself, but it's real. The Johnsons claimed land 5 miles east of Grace and James, close enough for mutual support, but far enough for independence. With 2 families working together, they were able to accomplish much more than either could have managed alone. By midsummer, word had spread through informal networks about the successful interracial community developing in their area of Kansas. Other families began arriving, some mixed-race couples like Grace and James, others simply people who believed in equality and were willing to work for it. The Hartwell family came from Ohio, a white couple with strong abolitionist beliefs who wanted their children to grow up in a more just society. The Martinez family traveled from New Mexico, seeking better opportunities for their children in a place where their mixed Mexican and Apache heritage wouldn't limit their prospects. Each new family strengthened the community that Grace and James were building. They established a school where all children could learn together, a general store that served everyone equally, and informal networks of mutual aid that helped families through difficult times. But growth also brought challenges. Not everyone in Kansas supported the idea of an integrated community, and tensions were rising throughout the territory over questions of slavery and statehood. The first serious threat came in late summer when a group of pro-slavery settlers from Missouri attempted to intimidate the integrated community into disbanding. Led by a man named Clayton Reed, they rode through the area making threats and demanding that the unnatural mixing of races be stopped. Grace recognized the tactics immediately. The same kind of intimidation used against slaves who dared to seek freedom or challenge the established order. We need to be ready to defend ourselves, James told the gathered families in an emergency meeting in the schoolhouse. These men aren't interested in compromise or peaceful coexistence. What about the law? Asked Henrik Peterson. Can't the territorial authorities help us? The territorial authorities are split along the same lines we are, Samuel Johnson replied grimly. Some support slavery, some oppose it. We can't count on outside help. Grace listened to the discussion with growing determination. She had fought for her freedom once before and was prepared to do it again. This community represented everything she had dreamed of during her years in bondage, a place where people were judged by their character rather than their skin color. We stand together, she said firmly when James asked for her opinion. No one runs this time. We've built something worth protecting here. The confrontation came 3 days later when Clayton Reed and a dozen armed followers rode into the heart of the community, demanding to speak with the leaders. Grace stood beside James in front of their cabin, with the other families arrayed nearby in a show of unity. She felt her old fear trying to surface, the terror of facing angry white men with the power to destroy her life. But this time was different. This time she wasn't alone and helpless. She was Grace Carson, a free woman with legal standing and a husband who would die before letting anyone harm her. You people need to leave, Reed announced without preamble. This territory isn't going to tolerate your unnatural mixing. Pack up and get out, or we'll make you get out. This is our home, James replied calmly. We have legal claims to this lawn.